This is the second lecture in the history module, which will cover the Middle Ages. We will cover the Middle Age and Renaissance, as well as Christianity and colonial America. First, when we discuss medieval Europe, you will note that this has been the fall of the Roman Empire. We discussed in the first lecture many of the possible reasons that led to the Roman Empire, including having such a vast conquering of land, they're unable to manage it, and then there's this idea that they use their leisure in a very unproductive way for society and lost sight of what their general purpose was for the common good. So we move into a time period where we have different forms of religion developing. And they consider this really the period between ancient and modern times. The former Roman Empire has been divided into kingdoms, and it's ruled by wealthy landowners. I'm sure you have probably watched Game of Thrones or other shows that might highlight some of this time period, but we refer to it as feudalism, and it produces a social class of individual, and it's based on distinctions between lords, vassals, and fiefs. And so you have this class structure where everyone reports to a noble, pays their taxes, and they're ruled by a wealthy landowner. And so because of this, leisure was often what we consider owned. So they had to do the leisure activities that was accepted in society. And of course, there were lots of things that were popular, including hunting with hounds, falconry, anything that dealt with hunting, fighting, sports, ways to deal with their land. They also had skipping contests, weapons, wrestling, musicians, acrobats, jugglers, storytellers, backgammon, and chess. So they had lots of different leisure activities, but what you have to realize is life was still very difficult. The average age during this time was 30 years old, and the Catholic Church ruled civilization. That was the way that they kept order. And early on, after the Bible was written, that only priests could interpret it. Well, during this time period that leads up to the Renaissance, more and more people learn how to read, which is a very important note. Also, the main goal of life was abstinence from worldly pleasures. And so they thought in order to move on to the next life or heaven, that you had to live a really strict life that prevented these types of things. Really, that had to do with working hard for good deeds and self-deprivation. And this is where you also see the real birth of the work ethic. Our next time period that we move through, we refer to as the Renaissance or the Rebirth. And you really see that this is where modern Europe emerges. Historians consider it a 300-year period where real changes of expression occur. And so you have Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Shakespeare, and many other art, music, forms of literature, plays really start to flourish during this time period. You see kind of a revolt against the Catholic Church, the taxes. People begin to read, and so maybe if their priest didn't interpret the Bible correctly, or they made their new laws, they realized that these were not fair. This is where books flood Europe, specifically on traveling. It's considered a man was worldly in his 20s if he had traveled all over the world. And so it's really a time of rediscovery and philosophy that we know as humanism, which emphasizes the capabilities and worth of every human being. This leads into around the early 14 to late 1400s, where we see people start to come to America. And for about 400 years up until now, there have been large waves of people who've sailed to the Americas. The original settlers who went to South America, of course, were met with the Aztecs and the Incas and civilizations in Mexico, Central America, South America, where they received lots of riches. They have lots of beautiful beaches, jungles, and gold. The people who settled North America, where we currently are today experienced something very different. They had a very rugged wilderness, very difficult living conditions. Most of you know the stories of the pilgrims. And really, a reason why people were motivated to cross the Atlantic was what they called the divine mission. And it was Protestants sought to purge society of godliness or godlessness. And so, what's interesting is when the Puritans came here, they changed their calendar in the 1600s and abolished all the Catholic holy days, including Christmas. They replaced them with holidays on fasting, humiliation, and Thanksgiving. And so, you can see over the years that the Protestants got tired of what was going on with the Renaissance, and they felt like it was this, you know, time of discovery that they didn't approve of. And their historians would mostly say that the leisure ethic with the Protestants and the early settlers of America was very utilitarian. And that means leisure and recreation was for the greater good. And so maybe all the women came together and made quilts. But that was for a family, or maybe they had barn raisings, or they sang in church. But this is where you start to see our leisure and recreation really influenced by this time period and the people who settled our country. This is where idle hands or the devil's work comes from. And so if you're being lazy, you're not using your leisure time wisely, it's considered poor. Like you shouldn't do that in society. And so leisure should be used for the social good. And so it's really important to understand these different time periods as we move through the Middle Ages, Renaissance, Christianity, and then ultimately the settling of America. Our next lecture will be examining leisure in modern times.